Great. I just want to thank our hosts at NICE for giving me the opportunity, and very happy to be here with so many colleagues. I've spent much of the last 18 months or so doing research on the Pacific Islands, including extensive travel and interviews in the region. And I'm in the process of finalizing a report for Crisis Group on the region. So what I'd like to do here is just share a few highlights from it. One thing I would note is that although the islands are relatively remote and distant from most of the areas many of the rest of you focus on, I think even if you don't care what happens to the Pacific Islands, they provide a fascinating case study in China's interactions with smaller states and many of the tactics and strategies that it employs. So I would encourage you to look at it in that regard as well. The Pacific Islands are often described as small and remote, but those labels miss the point entirely. For China, it's a vast maritime domain with exclusive economic zones that span 29 million square kilometers, roughly the size of the entire African continent. And for China, that means it's a critical theater of influence between the second and third island chains. It fits into Indo-Pacific geostrategic concepts that are being applied by the Western powers that China is increasingly in rivalry with, but it also fits into Chinese strategic thinking as a kind of more distant periphery. And the degree to which China can have influence in that region, particularly through the second and third island chains, that has implications for its ability to achieve dominance and sea control and overall a sphere of influence in the Western Pacific or its near seas. So these, the pieces are all interlocking, right? And it also, as a region itself, similarly to the South China Sea, it offers vital resources, strategic sea lanes, and a pathway potentially to disrupt traditional power balances. Let's keep in mind that for the Chinese, the PLA Navy, to get out to the blue Pacific and really become a global actor, it needs to pass through the EEZs of other states almost entirely. So what happens in the Pacific and who holds the balance of influence there is relevant also to China's global ambitions and also in a number of other ways. So China's role in the Pacific is the result of decades of calculated strategy. It's guided by ambitions to reshape global power dynamics, and it's being deliberate and assertive. It has a strategy. It's employing targeted diplomacy, debt-driven economic engagement to expand its influence. It's using elite capture and dual-use infrastructure. It's embedding itself as a dominant player. And the tactics reveal a methodological approach to deepen a foothold and reshape the region. And it's doing so through diplomatic, economic, and security sector means. So let me just touch on those three briefly. But one framework that one could maybe for a little fun apply to it is if you have any familiarity with the Japanese game Go, or in Chinese as it's known, Weiqi. I think that metaphor in this case is kind of useful for thinking about that methodical and incremental strategy, but particularly securing small but significant positions to shape the broader landscape. So it's not so much about a chess game of one party or the other is going to win or lose. It's playing for advantage and filling in empty spaces on the board where your influence is greater than your opponent's. And in the Pacific, that entails expanding presence through infrastructure projects, economic cooperation agreements, and security partnerships. It's not primarily a military competition, but rather one of geopolitical influence. And while China's initiatives promise development and connectivity, they often come with hidden costs, including eroding governance, creating dependency, and in some cases even threatening sovereignty. So the stakes include not just resources and trade routes, but the ability of Pacific nations to chart their own independent futures. Let's talk about diplomatic and political influence for a moment. China's diplomatic efforts have intensified over the last 2 decades, built ties through aid, investments, high-profile visits. It's worked systematically, particularly since 2006, to isolate Taiwan, persuading nations like Kiribati and the Solomon Islands to switch diplomatic recognition, more recently Nauru as well. And it's not just about symbolism, it's about constraining Taiwan's international space and consolidating power and asserting its own legitimacy. China now has more accredited diplomats in the Pacific than any other country, and their average rank and experience has increased over the past decade. 8 Pacific Island countries have signed comprehensive strategic partnership agreements with China as a signal of deeper political and economic alignment. In the United Nations General Assembly, for example, on average over the last decade, or actually after the last 2 decades, Pacific nations have aligned with China's positions 69% of the time, compared with just 9% aligned with the United States. And that's even with the 3 freely associated states having deep security compacts with the US. Between 2012 and 2022, China provided about $4.5 billion in pledged aid to and mostly through low-interest loan to the Pacific Island nations, which makes it now the second largest bilateral donor in the region, albeit still way behind Australia as the principal donor. But it also, one of the critical problems with this, because much of what China does arguably is no different from what any other great power or major power might do in that kind of a region. And much of what it does is not necessarily malign. It's simply in competition with other more traditional or established powers who may be uncomfortable with the relatively newer player. But it's not necessarily doing anything outside the rules, if you will. But where its diplomacy becomes complicated is in its calculated and targeted influence campaigns to align Pacific leaders with Beijing's broader goals. Programs like the China-Pacific Islands Political Leadership Dialogue that bring regional politicians into Beijing's orbit. We're actually seeing the International Department of the Communist Party increasingly leading and engaging with these, the United Front Work Department and United Front agencies increasingly involved. And these initiatives promote a narrative that glorifies China's governance model while fostering personal relations with political elites. And its tactics often rely on elite capture that involves using strategic corruption in many cases to cultivate personal relations with decision makers, often through financial inducements or business opportunities. Leaders are offered incentives, sometimes directly, sometimes through proxies, and these efforts bypass traditional institutions and focus on individuals and their personal interests, reshaping decision-making at the highest levels. Unfortunately, small Pacific nations are particularly vulnerable to this type of corruption. They have limited resources and fragile institutions. And so for China, the strategy is both cost-effective and impactful. And it exploits cultural norms in the Pacific in these traditional societies where gifts from leaders to their communities, patronage networks, politics are very small and local and personal in these island societies, most of which are only a few 100,000 in population. But the result ends up being a growing alignment of local elite interests and power structures with China's strategic interests. I heard time and time again as I traveled through the region, to put it bluntly, that the Chinese are going around bribing our officials to do things that they want them to do. It's sometimes much more subtle and cloaked through development projects and opportunities for kickbacks on larger projects. But the number of times that I heard that it was just simply envelopes and bags of cash being handed over, debit cards, for example, for accounts. There's a lot of that kind of thing going on. And especially in these small developing societies, that has a really corrosive effect on governance, accountability, transparency, and in general, socio-political stability, because the people know what's going on and they're increasingly frustrated with it. So China's, as part of course, all that economic engagement, China's economic footprint has expanded rapidly with the Belt and Road Initiative as the overall framework for it. Most Pacific Islands have joined the BRI and is building ports, roads, telecommunications projects backed by Chinese loans and firms. So again, following a playbook that anyone who studied China's geopolitics and geoeconomic strategy in Asia is well familiar with, it's replicating that in the Pacific Islands, albeit with limits, because of course they're such small economies. Many of the Chinese mega projects aren't really feasible there. It has to scale down the size of the project it's doing. But it's still made over $3 billion worth of infrastructure investments across the region: airports, ports, roads, public buildings, improving connectivity and economic potential. A lot of benefits from this infrastructure, but they also come with opaque terms and in many cases have created significant debt burdens for recipient nations, as seen, for example, with Tonga's debt to the Export-Import Bank of China, or Exim Bank, which is about a quarter of its GDP. That economic expansion is more than development. It's developing strategic leverage. The infrastructure projects promise progress, but the dependency ties leaders to Beijing's agenda, compromising their autonomy and their priorities. For some countries, there's a risk of debt sustainability, but Chinese lenders in general are unwilling to work collaboratively with other lenders for rescheduling and so on. At the best, usually there's a willingness to extend the timelines on those debts. I'm not going to make the argument that China is deliberately creating debt traps. I think that's an unintended consequence, but the leverage is definitely there, and the relationships are definitely being strengthened as a result. It's also driven by an appetite for Pacific resources, which are quite deeply entrenched. About 3.3 billion worth of Pacific resources, mostly mining, minerals, timber, fish, flows to China. It makes it now the Pacific's largest consumer and one of its largest trading partners. At the heart of that is China's distant water fishing fleet, which is also now the largest, and backed by billions in subsidies. It's ballooned from about 50 vessels in 2009 to over 550 by 2020. This dominance comes at a cost. Illegal, unregulated, and unsustainable practices, or IUU fishing, are rampant. These activities erode fish stocks and imperil the livelihoods of countless Pacific communities. Meanwhile, the digital Silk Road is embedding Chinese technologies into Pacific economies. You've got fiber optic networks, Huawei 5G systems, Beidou navigation platforms are becoming staples across the region. And while they enhance connectivity and, of course, are lower cost than many other options, they also raise concerns about surveillance, information control, and even espionage. And we're also seeing increasing Chinese influence on media censorship and disinformation in Pacific media. Lastly, then, security objectives. China's foray into Pacific security sectors is among the most controversial aspects of its strategy, certainly as far as the US and Australia and France are concerned. Its dual-use facilities are central to the strategy. I don't think China is on the verge of establishing a military base in the Pacific, although it would certainly like to if it could. But ports and airstrips, often built under the guise of commercial development, can be useful as places rather than bases for logistical purposes. And those partnerships grant China access to critical national security infrastructures. The classic case is, of course, the secret agreement that China forged in between 22 and 23 with the Solomon Islands. Ostensibly focused on maintaining domestic law and order, the terms allow for the deployment of Chinese security personnel, including military and People's Armed Police, and the potential establishment of permanent facilities, naval port visits, which can be supported by Chinese logistics facilities. And so they really blur the line between cooperation and, to some extent, suasion or coercion, and raise concerns about the long-term implications for regional stability, particularly because the pact had implications for all the Pacific Islands, but it was not consulted widely with any of them. It was presented as a fait accompli. So it raises the question, if China is open about its engagement, why is it being so secretive about agreements like this? Its broader strategic objectives include extending its military reach in the Pacific by securing access to critical infrastructure, embedding itself within Pacific security normative frameworks, and essentially becoming a key actor in the security architecture of the region in rivalry to all the established ones. So what's next? For many Pacific Island countries and territories, the intensifying competition between China and the West is an unwelcome distraction. Their priorities are focused on sustainable development, climate adaptation, and maintaining sovereignty, and they've expressed that through a 2050 Blue Pacific vision, which emphasizes an ocean-centric regional order. The challenge they have is that both the Indo-Pacific concepts of many other states and China's own efforts to create a sphere of influence are constraining their ability to actually shape their own destiny. They face extreme power asymmetries with larger states like China, the US, and Australia. Some are leaning towards Beijing in the case of the Solomon Islands. Most others are trying to balance, and a few are bandwagon or hedging. So we're seeing a fairly sort of classic international relations behavior among the states as they try to get advantages and extract the best benefits they can from both China and its Western rivals. But the challenge is that none of them have ever dealt with an entity like the party state before. And the the disparity between their state capacity to manage an actor like that is trying to essentially get into all aspects of their societies in order to be able to manipulate and influence them, really puts them at risk of ultimately not just elite capture and media capture, but ultimately state capture. And I think that's really the goal for China, is to essentially create a dozen client states in that region between the first and second island chains, so that it can interfere with the activities of other governments that have interests there and ultimately shape the region so that it tilts towards Chinese preferences. The Pacific Islands have an opportunity, if they organize themselves effectively enough, to leverage their increased strategic importance to maximize their own agency and secure better outcomes for their people. But to do that, they need to really strengthen and make more resilient their own governance and accountability systems and be more strategic about how they choose to partner with them. What other countries can do is focus on providing them with sustained support, transparent partnerships, more values-driven engagement, and make sure that they have real alternatives. Because one of the easiest ways that China comes and shifts that regional balance is simply because there's a lack of support from other partners that those islands might prefer. So a realistic goal is not somehow preventing China from being a major player in the Pacific Islands. I think that's inevitable and understandable given China's global role. The key is trying to maintain a balance of power and influence that enables the Pacific Islands themselves to navigate and keep their own sovereignty and agency of decision making. They're at a crossroads about that, and the changes they make today are going to shape their future for decades to come. So it's a discourse that needs to shift from not only great power competition to ensuring the region's sovereignty, regional consensus and unity, and sustainability. Thank you.